one would want to find out where are the origins of these resources, where did the wealth come from, when these universities established, where do they have the repositories of knowledge, where did they get the database that they're using to build themselves. It's a long history that will take you to slave trade, slave plantations. So when we talk about the wealth of the global north, which is reflected in the academia, we must be aware, we must be conscious that it has a history, that those universities have a history, and there are people who have lost in that history. The perpetuation of that hierarchy, within the system of academia. And it means that you use data from the global south and enrich your research, enrich your publications in the global north. So at the end of the day, it's the global north universities that will have higher ranking. Of course, the institutions that do the higher ranking themselves are based in the global north. So you come get raw data, and sometimes they don't even cite, local scholars. They don't cite the resource persons that they engage here, so that we don't replicate these structures of colonialism in which you come, use Africa as a source of your raw materials, then you go process, add value to that academic resource that you extracted from Africa, then bring it back for Africans to cite your work. I think even academia is still racialized. It's not race-free. Even as much as we are talking about state actors, even at the level of departments, we are talking of Department of German Studies, Department of Somali Studies, it's still a racialized thing.
Hi there, and welcome to a new episode on the Nubianometry podcast, where we discuss issues relating to geopolitics, geoeconomics, and development issues on the African continent. Today, our guest is called Oduor Obura. He's an academic, he's a researcher, and he's a cultural studies expert as well as a post-colonial studies specialist. And the show today is going to cover about 1 hour of discussions of certain interesting topics, ranging from basically post-colonial issues on the African continent. For instance, have you ever wondered about a term called parachute science or helicopter research? Have you also followed closely debates about reparations or even the return of museum artifacts back into the African continent? So our cultural studies specialist, Oduor Obura, he will introduce himself shortly. We'll delve into most of these areas during the next 1 hour. Tag along. So Oduor Obura, thank you very much for coming to the Nubianometry podcast, episode 007. Would you shortly want to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Foremost, thank you for welcoming me into this podcast. It's my pleasure to be with you and all the audience. I'm a cultural studies scholar. Yes, I'm interested in post-colonial research. I'm interested in a bit of museum conversations between the global north and the global south. So I guess it's just the whole spectrum of power imbalance between the north and the south, reflected in cultural encounters, histories, and knowledge practices. So I think it's a pretty wide area. I'm not saying I'm an expert in all of that, but I have a little bit of some insights into what it means to be from the global south and interact with the global north.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jumping into the conversation right in, decolonizing African literature. I think that has been a topic over the past 5-6 decades, especially coming out from the independence, post-independence period. Marxists always refer to it as flag independence, like it was not really independence, or maybe political independence, but not economic independence. Anyway, the person I'm thinking about, a literary giant on the continent and even in the world, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. There's a time where I was reading about the huge change or shift that came into the literature department at the University of Nairobi. I think it was in the early 70s, where Ngugi led a group of scholars at the time to push more towards teaching African literature. And that was kind of baptized decolonizing literature, because up to that point, a lot of literature that had been taught in African universities was basically British or Western literature. What's your take on the legacy of Ngugi wa Thiong'o up till today? And do you think a lot of effort has been made in decolonizing African literature, let's say across the continent, from, let's say, the early 70s, where Ngugi wa Thiong'o led this paradigm shift and change at the University of Nairobi?
Yeah, that's an interesting question there that you posed to me. I have some rather strong opinions about the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. Foremost, I'll give Ngugi his flowers as far as the debate on decolonizing the mind is concerned. But I think we also need to understand that, and probably also sort of deviate from this Ngugi as a main character syndrome in abolition of the English department at the University of Nairobi. We need to understand the wider context that, one, this was a sort of a continental-wide wave that was flowing all over the countries that were gaining independence from Britain and other European powers in the continent in the 60s. Ghana, I think, was the first in 1957 to attain independence. Now, what happened in terms of the politics of the day was that the governments of the day, from Ghana, Kenya, wherever, name these black, so-called sub-Saharan countries, they had an administrative need and imperative to have a reflection of self-determination within the ranks of the officers governing the countries. So there was that wide Africanization program that happened across so many countries. And I can speak specifically about Kenya on its Africanization program. You have the likes of Tom Mboya who are championing, filling in the administrative ranks with indigenous, local, black, Kenyan population as officers from junior to senior. This is something that happened from the military and everywhere. Now, when we speak about academia, before I move down to the level of the department within at the University of Nairobi, we had an Africanization program. And this was spearheaded by what many might not know, the historian Bethuel Ogot was in charge of this Africanization program, right? And this policy sort of was broken down to various units of governance, from the Ministry of Education, the military, health, and so on. We wanted to encourage much more manpower. So at the level of the university, they were simply, putting into practice what was expected by the political class, that we have Africans, taking charge of African affairs. And this is where Ngugi comes in. So I'm not going to say that it's Ngugi alone who was in charge of this program, as is often reported elsewhere. But I want us to be always conscious of the wider context, that this was an Africanization program, of which UN was but one of the many government departments that were to implement the Africanization program. And at the level of the department, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Henry Owuor Anyumba, and Taban Loliong were the voices behind the abolition of the English department in favor of the Department of African Literature and Languages. Yes, I think that's something that I wanted to bring first of all tonight, that we don't center Ngugi on the story.
I think what I read was just mentioning Ngugi and that shift. And so I'm not an expert and I've not delved deeply into it. And I think you've really brought it out quite well.
Yes, I think that's an important thing that many people do not know. And I'm so glad that I have such a forum to...
And anyway, you have a P.h.D. in cultural studies, literature, stuff like that. So this is really your domain. And now, moving to your question about the language thing, I think this one was first broached at the Makerere conference in 1962 on what language the African literature should be. I think the jury is still out there on whether we should write in local languages or whether we should use European languages like English, the Europhone zone generally. I think there are pros and cons to it, but I look forward to a day. Because I think the main one I've seen people argue against indigenous languages, and you can even talk about Latin America. You have a lot of indigenous languages, Quechua, Aymara. The sad reality is that English is a very dominant international language, and so you can teach indigenous languages and write books, but ultimately they also have to be translated into the dominant language of the day. Otherwise, you will basically not relegate, but let's say marginalize exactly somebody who would have attained, let's say, international renown. I mean, Ngugi, I think, is a special case. But some other people, if you were to insist that way, you might marginalize yourself from that international exposure. And that's why people can understand that true, you are a Pan-African, you really want to follow it. The Pan-African ideals, you want to elevate the indigenous languages, but you also have to be alive to the sad reality of the world that the colonial powers, post-colonial powers, maybe some people will say they still neo-colonialism, their languages are still the dominant languages in the world of today. So it's also almost like if you decide to go that route, you should be alive to the fact that maybe you will suffer for it, or you will not gain the highest level of exposure internationally if you are a writer. Yeah,
Absolutely. I think I do agree with you on some concepts. But I also think I'm of the opinion that languages are specific to certain cultures, or cultures have specific languages. So expressing yourself in a language means that you have the entire culture with you in that specific moment. You know, there's also, again, the impossibility of an absolute cultural translation, because there are concepts and ideas that can only be expressed, for example, in Dholuo, in Ekegusi, in Lulogoli, in Gikuyu, and so on and so forth. So as much as we try to speak or write English, we can never 100% capture the nuances and the subtleties that exist within our oral cultures and oral practices and our own native languages or local languages, you know. So I think it's important that we develop our own languages, and I do agree with Ngugi on this, that our languages are expressions of who we are. They are carriers of our own cultures, and to do away with them would mean to do away with aspects of who we are, aspects of our histories, and probably aspects of our futures.
Yeah, I think it's quite true. And I think, for Ngugi, he has achieved a lot. And even while writing in his native Kikuyu and then being translated into other languages, like he's been winning prizes all over the world. I think there's a time the Catalan people in northern Spain, Barcelona area, like they even gave him a prize. And interestingly enough, I think he also won the Osnabrücker Frieden Prize, the Peace Prize in Osnabrück for literature. I think I'd left Osnabrück at the time, 2019, towards the end. But my guest father was still there, and I remember he sent me something on WhatsApp and he was like, Ngugi wa Thiong'o is coming and he's going to receive the prize. So I think for him, maybe he was an outlier alongside, of course, many names across the African continent. I mean, you are in literature, so you know them probably much better. Chinua Achebe. Wole Soyinka.
Yeah, we've had quite a good run, you know, as a continent in terms of producing globally acclaimed writers, Ngugi being one of them. But I look forward to a day in which, when we speak about prizes, we will value more local prizes. You know, we have the Jomo Kenyatta Foundation, we have the Kenya Literature Bureau that will have prizes that are equal in stature to our local contexts, you know. You mentioned Osnabrück and Ngugi's, you know, chase for the Nobel Prize for Literature, which will never come. I hope it does not come. I hope it doesn't win the prize for a reason that we don't have to seek validation elsewhere. We are valid in terms of our own existence.
And in terms of the effort you've already done and what you have already achieved. So you don't necessarily need international validation.
We don't need to be legitimized by prizes in Europe or
in other places of the world.
So if it doesn't win for me, that's a good thing.
Transitioning quite nicely into the education systems in Africa as we have them today. I mean, in Kenya, over the past couple of years, there have been some debates about the CBC system, competency-based curriculum. Quite controversial. I think it was already in Ghana from 2015 going onwards, if I'm not wrong. And there's this idea that the systems that we had previously, let's say over the past 3 decades, were not working well for the population in terms of the job market and stuff like that. And therefore, there was a need to shift. My question to you will be, do you think, as we are today, are African education systems decolonialized?
I think we are not.
We are not.
Decolonization is a process. It's not a destination. It's a process, because every day something new comes that we need to address. You know, we are talking about centuries of domination, or maybe decades of domination. So I don't think that we can say we are completely decolonized. You remember South Africa and so forth, the Rhodes, must fall, and all these are decolonial debates. And coming,
I think we'll also come into that down the road.
Yeah, but coming closer
remember
home.
You have the Rhodes Scholarship, so
yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, coming closer home about the CBC thing. We must always ask ourselves, who is driving this agenda of CBC?
Yeah.
Look at the European nations pushing the CBC agenda in Kenya.
Yeah.
Where do for example, the top mandarins in our ministry go to seek, the so-called benchmarking?
Mm-hmm.
Then suddenly Germany comes into mind, as one of the countries behind CBC in Kenya.
Britain.
Yeah, Britain.
Because I think I had in Ghana as well as even here.
Yeah.
When I had Mutemi Wakiyama on the show, in the third episode, we also explored a little bit of that area. And his argument was that originally it was supposed to be modeled against the Nordic system, which I think is way much better, according to the way he put it. But then somewhere down the road, British Council came in, and what they had tried to implement in Ghana is ultimately what was pushed here in Kenya. Yeah.
And you see, the moment you mention Britain, Germany, of course, the British case is special because we are opening wounds that have not yet healed, the colonial wounds and the colonial design of education system. The African was simply the native. You are to do basic arithmetics, not complex maths, and hygiene and religion. These are basic things that were being taught within the British designed education systems. And when 60 years later, you have Britain again involved in the designing our curriculum. Of course, it raises questions about legacies of colonialism and the present forms of neo-colonialism. So I think as a country, if we have to seek and attain self-determination, then we must design our own curriculum without, having unquestioned acceptance of curriculum designed in Europe. It works for them over there.
Yeah.
They have the resources.
Yeah.
I remember attending a CBC lesson in Germany for my son who was in grade 1, I think, when I was in Germany.
You're doing your PhD?
Yeah.
At the University of Potsdam?
Yeah, I was at the University of Potsdam. And where my kid was going for his schooling was, a kindergarten that neighbors the university. And the lesson was on traffic lights. And they were taken away from school. They went and observed, the traffic lights start changing from red, orange, green, Do our traffic lights even function?
In so many traffic lights, we even have police officers.
Yeah, so then it means on that aspect, CBC has failed. We don't have the resources. It might have been a good idea, but we don't have the resources. And then the figures behind it all reeks of neo-colonialism, Because one thing I've come to discover, Europe does nothing to you for free. There's always what is in it for us.
Yeah, it's called WIIFM.
Yeah.
What's in it for me?
What's in it for me?
The radio FM is singing that one song.
Yeah, what's in it for me?
There's always that quote attributed to Socrates. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the British, these are hools when it comes to diplomacy.
Yeah. There's a historical aspect I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about just shortly. Now you've said our education systems, definitely they're not decolonized.
Though we've made some progress.
We've made some progress. Yeah. So going back, there's an interesting article I think I'd read some time back. We were still a Kenya colony at the time, I think the early 1920s. And we were starting to have political associations. And this was the time when Harry Thuku was the person who came up front. And from what I was reading, because I was reading a lot about African American literature, but also the impact they had on Pan-Africanism, the origins. Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington in the U.S. So in the U.S., the big debate was there were these two rivals, Marcus Garvey, not Marcus Garvey, but Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who, among other people, they went ahead and formed the NAACP. And in terms of education, the big one was W.E.B. Du Bois pushed classical education. So university degrees, liberal arts, stuff like that, philosophy, etc. Booker T. Washington pushed more of the technical education. People needed to learn a trade. You need to learn something with your hands. You are a plumber, you are an electrician, you are a carpenter.
Yeah.
And he believed that for the black people in America, trades was much more better. W.E.B. Du Bois pushed so much classical education. So the article I read, the person argued that Thuku wrote a letter to some of the leading lights in the US at the time, in the early 1920s. And apparently the people who replied, I think it was Booker T. Washington, the people who were pushing technical education and not classical education. In a nutshell, the argument was that what we found coming into Kenya at the time, even as a colony, was the promotion of the technical education, which the colonial powers didn't find bad per se, because there was this idea that if you give these people classical education and they start developing stuff like African philosophy and looking at things that are really high perspective, then they will cause trouble down the road. Yeah. So I don't know, have you ever heard about that debate, and what will be your take?
Yeah, I'm conversant with the debate, between Booker T and Du Bois.
Washington and Du Bois, yeah.
Yeah. I think one, it's the nature of people to seek supremacy. They say two cocks cannot be bred in the same home or something.
Yeah.
There's that proverb. And I suppose this also plays a role in the conflict between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, So as much as we are taking, and in my opinion, I would not want to say that we have to choose an either or. We need both. Because if we are to develop ourselves, if we have to invent new services and new products, we need both. We need the technicians, and we need people who can look at society,
So A and B, not either or.
Because
either or locks us in a kind of a
necessary
bivalence
binarity.
logic. Exactly.
Yeah. We need both. We don't need either or.
But do you think the numbers matter? Because even today, there are so many debates in the US from African Americans. You have so many. Do you know Umar Johnson?
Yeah.
I've heard him on the Breakfast Club so many times and on so many other podcasts. He says there are so many black people. They have PhDs, master's degrees. They have no jobs. Like the classical education is so saturated, and yet that is the one that is still becoming much more promoted. You and I both lived in Germany around the same period of time. You're doing your PhD, I was doing my master's. You are starting to see the same thing in Germany, because you are being told 10 years ago, so many Germans were doing the apprenticeship programs, the Atsubis, and they were becoming tradespeople. But there was a shift, I think, with the Bologna process in 2004, where they abolished the diploma master system, and they came up with the one that we understand even in Kenya, the bachelor, master's, PhD. And then there was a shift where so many people now started going into university degrees, the classical education. And after a very short period of time, it becomes so saturated that the only jobs that can be found are in the technical path and not the classical education path.
I think one thing that we need to appreciate more, which we don't do a lot, is the need or the rationale for education. Why do people go to school? Do you go to a school to get a job? People have different opinions whether a schooling system is meant to churn out, products. I don't look at schooling as a system of churning out products who are going to be cogs in a factory setting or an industrialization process. I'm looking at schooling as a change of attitude, as a way to better yourselves. If it brings economic byproducts, so be it.
Gains,
but I don't think, for me, my PhD was a way of seeking some sort of self-enlightenment, self-actualization.
But somebody could argue it's because you're working in academia. Like even in Europe, in America, in the rest of the world, people are going into academia. You can say you are pursuing further studies up to even the PhD level and postdoc out of self-actualization, self-fulfillment, knowledge in the society, research, advancing research, etc., science. But for the vast majority of people, they might not admit it, but people are going to school and getting those degrees so they can have a job. And if they already have a job, maybe a second degree will have them get promoted or something of the sort so that they can make more money.
But I think it's a fallacy to imagine that you go to school to get money. Otherwise, we'd have academia as the top, as the highest paying, industry. It doesn't. And I don't think...
Because the argument will also be the way the world is built, like the current capitalist system. If you don't have money, like, you are nothing. And so that's why most people will argue the education systems all over the world, not only maybe in Africa, but maybe in Africa and other developing countries, it's much more pronounced, or on steroids, basically. But people will still say people go to school, the entire education system, Of course, the knowledge is there as a byproduct, etc. But at the end of the day, the main thing that people want is to get a source of livelihood, basically.
That might be true, but I think to cast education in terms of job implies that this is a commercial process. And to think of education as a commercial process is to lose the sight of what education does. It's simply to make you a better person, to question your surroundings, right?
And anyway, that's what most people also would say, let's say in Kenya, how much education has become commercialized. The universities, the private schools in primary and high school, like it's now pretty much a business.
Yeah, and anytime you start thinking of education in terms of, getting a job, you fall into the trap of being, seeking, that capitalist sort of ambition that many people go into. And in the long term, capitalism never builds anything. It destroys everything. So if you look at it in terms of getting money, then you're simply destroying our education. Let's first of all think of education as a guidance on to what kind of people do we want? What kind of society do we need? Right? Do we need people who are all, self-seeking so that we design education for people to get jobs? Or do we need an education that makes you a society, that gives you peace, gives you joy? I mean, for me, these are the questions I ask about education.
Technically, most people, I understand your point, the point you're making about education being much more than, let's say, what the capitalist conveyor belt requires of the products that are going into the assembly. All right, so let's transition into the next theme of discussion, which I alluded to at the beginning in the intro, parachute science or helicopter research. I've also seen it being referred to on the internet as neocolonial science. This idea that, of course, the global north, the universities there are much more richer. They have better resources to conduct research. So there's this idea that a researcher will come from Europe, from America. They parachute or they helicopter in to Kenya, Rwanda, Ghana, Peru, Colombia, etc. They conduct their research and then they go back. They publish in journals in the global north, which have a much wider reach and, let's say, reputation and renown. And in all this process, local indigenous researchers, academics, they're kind of bypassed. I don't know, what's your take on parachute science, helicopter research? Being an academic yourself.
Yeah, and I think it's not an accident that we are where we are right now. It's by design. And I think there are colonial machinations behind all of these things.
Undertones, yeah.
Yeah, because we are talking about the global north being better endowed with the resources, then one would want to find out where are the origins of these resources? Where did the wealth come from? When were these universities established? Where do they have the repositories of knowledge? Where did they get the database that they're using to build themselves?
Yeah.
It's a long history that will take you to slave trade, slave plantations. So when we talk about the wealth of the global north, which is reflected in the academia, we must be aware, we must be conscious that it has a history, that those universities have a history, and there are people who have lost in that history. Two, as someone who lives in the global south and conducts research in the global south and partially also in the global north,
Yeah.
I think parachute science is a perpetuation of that hierarchy, within the system of academia. And it means that you use data from the global south and enrich your research, enrich your publications in the global north. So at the end of the day, it's the global north universities that will have higher ranking. Of course, the institutions that do the higher ranking themselves are based in the global,
north. Yeah.
So you come get raw data, and sometimes they don't even cite, local scholars. They don't cite the resource persons that they engage here. I think we need to be aware of these hierarchies that exist and confront these hierarchies without fear. And as someone in the global north, I think it's only fair to, engage in standard scholarly practice and also partner, collaborate with researchers from the global south.
And actually, that's what I wanted to ask you, because you're in that space and you're doing research in both the global north and the global south.
Yes.
In your own experience, is there more collaboration? Let's say when you have parachute scientists come in, do they, let's say, reach out to local academics and tell you, hey, can we collaborate on a particular project, write a journal article as a collaboration, as a joint effort? Or in your personal experience, and not only you, but your other academic colleagues,
circles.
like circles, exactly. What are you hearing? Like, is there much more collaboration happening, or are you guys experiencing parachute science in the worst form?
I think one of the things that has happened of late in academia is the rise of decolonial thinking. I keep on going to this because it has created more consciousness, more awareness on the imbalances between North and South. So I think right now, for example, I'm doing some research collaboration with some scientists based in Norway. We are co-writing a paper, doing some joint research.
Yeah.
So there's that rise in awareness that we need to have a fair practice even within academia so that we don't replicate these structures of colonialism in which you use Africa as a source of your raw materials, then you go process, add value to that academic resource that you've extracted from Africa, then bring it back for Africans to cite your work. So I think it helps to have that collaborative approach.
Can we refer to it as academic wokeness? Even though wokeness has taken an entirely different meaning nowadays. But you can say like some global North researchers have become slightly aware of the injustice that global South academics are facing and researchers.
Yeah.
And so they're trying in their little own way to at least repair the damage that has been done or ensure that they're not repeating the same damage that previous academics have done.
I think that wokeness exists, but it's not everyone who is woke in academia. There are others who are still stuck in the colonial traditions of conducting academia and conducting research. But I know for sure that in some spaces, researchers and colleagues in the global North are aware of these, undertones that exist in academia, and they try to accommodate the same or to recalibrate that relationship so that you take care of these imbalances.
Yeah.
But I think on the whole, as much as it may happen in academia that some are conscious, we still have the state to deal with. We are talking of, for example, getting a visa to go to UK or to USA for a workshop, for a seminar. We are a long way from home in terms of an effective collaboration.
Even in academia where somebody could be like, you are not a tourist, you are going for an academic conference or something, you should probably be viewed at a different level. You are contributing to research, you are attached to a university here locally, but you'll still be treated when applying for a visa as pretty much somebody who wants to flee from Africa to go to Europe to have a better life.
Yeah, that if we are to have these collaborations, then we must have policies backing these collaborations at a state level so that at an inter-university, we can have these good intentions, but we know at the end of the day, when I travel, when I go to the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, I'll be an African and I'll be flying out as an African. Traveling as an African is not an easy thing, whether you're in academia or not.
Yeah. Also tying quite nicely to what you were talking about, let's say, academics in the global North who still have the colonial mindset. I don't know if you followed this story. It was, I think, back in 2015. Essentially, the theme we are going to talk about is decolonization activism, especially in the age of social media. So I was reading about it. It was on X. There was a researcher, he's a German, but he had gone to study and work in the US for a long time. I can't remember the university. But so he was starting new Somalia studies because I think he had also worked and done research a lot in Somaliland and Puntland. And so he reached a point, of course, he has the backing of the university and everything, and their funding, and they wanted to start Somali studies. Pretty much the same way you have German studies, or you have, on the continent, it's always African studies, a very general and broad term. So he wanted to have a specific school. I think there was a Somali Ph.D. who tried to apply for a position, and the researcher said that there was no Somali who, was good enough for the program. Like they're not interested in Somali studies, something of the sort. Now, I think the guy already was speaking Somali. And so he basically brushed off this lady, and this lady went on X, and there were a lot of people who came to support her. But the German academic actually doubled down. No, you guys are not the best fit. And I'm the one who is going to push this agenda of the Somali studies.
That's quite unfortunate.
So the people played around with the word and called it Cadaan studies. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correct, but Cadaan in Somali is white. So it was like, this guy is promoting white studies. There's nothing about Somali studies he was doing. So I think that also ties into decolonization activism and also the fact that you are saying this colonial, neo-colonial mindset. You still even find it in academia in the global north.
Yeah, I think even academia is still racialized. It's not race-free. Even as much as we are talking about state actors, even at the level of departments, we are talking of Department of German Studies, Department of Somali Studies, it's still a racialized thing. It's quite unfortunate what happens, because on the whole, I do think many Germans tend to be self-reflective, probably because of their history, and trying to atone for that sort of history. But like I said before, some of it boils down to individual, aspirations, individual, clinging to outdated beliefs about race. And decolonization activism, also in the context of, once again, the social media age. There were, I think you can remember this one, which are quite recent, I think just before COVID, we had the protest, I think in the UK, Plymouth, and people wanted to throw a statue of some slaveholder from the 16th century.
It was put up to commemorate a man who profited from trading African slaves. Today, it was pulled down by those desperate to show that Black Lives Matter. One protester in Bristol even knelt on the figure's neck, imitating the death of George Floyd in the US, which sparked all of this.
They pulled it down.
The controversial statue of slave trader Edward Colston was then dumped into the harbour.
All the way down to South Africa with the Rhodes Must Fall.
Fast forward to March 2015, thousands of students staged protests and sit-ins demanding the statue come down.
What the students are demanding is that the universities become African, and that means we need to change everything from who writes the textbooks, who gets to teach those textbooks, how the courses are structured, and who gets to be part of those lectures.
So like in, I think, a couple of universities in South Africa, you have the statues of Cecil Rhodes.
The Rhodes Must Fall movement ignited a spark on campuses across the country. Other colonial statues were defaced. Some Afrikaners took offence.
As mense dink dat hulle kan beelde vernietig en beelde besmeer en so wissel die geskiedenis uitmaak uit die fout van hulle lewe.
And I mean, I don't know about the Rhodes Scholarship. Maybe it's linked together.
Even some black students questioned the movement, pointing out that Rhodes donated money to establish Rhodes University as well as the Rhodes Fellowship at Oxford.
So you had that strong decolonization activism.
Africans make up less than 10% of teaching staff at UCT. At WITS, whites hold 55% of teaching jobs and 57% of senior management posts.
Transformation has many dimensions, and I want to immediately acknowledge that the area where we're making least and slowest progress is the area of academic staff.
But finally, on 9th April, UCT gave in and Cecil John Rhodes came tumbling down.
History in the making.
Despite Rhodes' demise, the majority of black South Africans are still excluded from higher education by poverty and discrimination. Rhodes' legacy lives on in companies like De Beers. And even Nelson Mandela had supported projects established in Rhodes' name.
I mean, and South Africa also, in some of the universities, I think they are still teaching in Afrikaans.
It remains closed as the University of Pretoria considers its options on whether lectures should be in English only or if Afrikaans remains. Outside campus, the Front National Party and AfriForum pledged to protect and support Afrikaans-speaking students on campus.
We all have the right to study in our own language, and I feel it's a fight that we have to stand for. We can't just stand back and let them do whatever they want to do. It's our right to stay here and to have class in our own language.
On the other side of the divide, economic freedom fighter Student Command, that started the Afrikaans Must Fall campaign, demands the total removal of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction at the university.
I don't know what's your take on if you followed the debate a little bit online?
Yeah, I'm aware of that, about decolonizing the education. So sometimes it's just important to be aware that what we experience, we might not be the first one. Sometimes we need to be aware of what others have done before us elsewhere. And speaking about decolonizing the education, I think South Africa is in an interesting situation where Kenya might have been in the 60s as far as a dominant white settler population existed in Kenya and then. But of course, the whites in South Africa would tell you that's the only home they know. They've been there generations.
Yeah.
So they're not going anywhere anytime
1652.
soon. Those are 400 centuries of settlement.
Almost 500 years.
Yeah,
and many of them
settlement.
also refer to themselves as settlers. They say the land they came to, there were not even Bantus there at the time. The Bantus had not yet migrated from Cameroon, Congo Forest. And so they say like some of them settled in the land, so they were settlers.
Yes, they are settlers, but interestingly, there's a low-key migration of so-called white South Africans away from South Africa to Australia, UK, USA. Elon Musk, for example, these kind of migrations.
Yeah.
It's happening not on a big scale, but it's also there.
Elon Tusk, yeah.
And what they say in South Africa, that since 1994, things have gone,
To the dogs.
they have gone to the dogs because we let them take control of the country. So there are all those dynamics at play in South Africa, and some cities like Cape Town, which is a pretty white city.
Yeah.
You
I've
know?
had a lot of stories about Cape Town.
So all these dynamics are at play in South Africa. So
In fact, there was a show on BBC News about, they were looking at black South African, let's say in the wine industry, wine growing industry. And there's a group of black South Africans, and I think the Coloureds, as they're called, down there. They were venturing into the sector in the late 90s, and like virtually all of it was still white. And some people are even saying, right now, like you can go and visit some of the wine farms, and there are ways in which, let's say, even black tourists are treated slightly differently to how, let's say, white tourists are treated in Cape Town.
Yeah. And something interesting which I find exciting with the Rhodes Must Fall movement and the decolonial theorization behind it. 1994, when South Africa gained black majority rule, up to now, that's about 30 years.
Yes.
So essentially what has happened, the 1994 generation is coming of age, and they're questioning the structures they found. So that's why you have got this decolonial movement happening in the last 10 years, because these are people who grew up in freedom. And now they're adults, they're young adults, and they don't see the fruits of that black empowerment programs as effective as they thought it should have been. So when they go to the university, definitely they're going to question the structure as it is. So I think it's a beautiful thing happening in South Africa. I can only tell them, welcome to the club.
Join the club.
Yeah.
Still tying to all this decolonization activism, there's also the topic that has come up from time to time. I think even when I went to Germany in 2016, it came out, I think during that winter semester or maybe a semester after in 2017, the issue about the Eurocentric Curricula. And so while we are still on the topic, like you find in so many African universities, a lot of the curricula, let's say at the university level, especially in the liberal arts, you're talking about political science, international relations, sociology, anthropology, psychology, a lot of it is still strongly Eurocentric. And some were arguing that, we need to have much more indigenous curricula. Like, let's say if you're talking about political philosophy, maybe 300, 400 years we didn't have any African philosophers. We would have to go, let's say, back to 2,000 years. Let's say during ancient Egypt and even far much back. Or there were some pockets of philosophers here and there, maybe during the Aksum Kingdom in Ethiopia, in the Songhai Empire in West Africa, etc. But like they were not as renowned as, let's say, the Enlightenment philosophers in Europe. But in the 20th century, we have Cheikh Anta Diop, we have... You were giving a lecture earlier about Achille Mbembe. We have a lot of philosophers, let's say, from the US, African Americans, John Henry Clark, J.A. Rogers, and many other people. And so the idea that somebody could make an argument, you don't have philosophers, you don't have Hobbes and Rousseau and Hegel, you had mentioned Hegel also, all these people. So there's no way we can give you a curricula that quite fits your situation. You just have to learn the Eurocentric curricula. I don't know what's your take on it, because you're also teaching in a local university.
Yeah, I teach in a local university, and one thing that I need to assert strongly so is when you mention that there were no philosophers, I think the point we need to acknowledge and appreciate is there was philosophy.
Yeah.
Certainly, there was philosophy. Philosophy has always existed in Africa. Then the question is, what sort of philosophy are we talking about? Are we thinking of philosophy from a Western tradition?
Very Western, actually. That's the difference I'm trying to make here anyway.
So
it's very subconscious.
Yeah,
because you talk about philosophy, it's Western philosophy you're talking about.
You see, at the basic level, and I think this is something that even the curriculum implies, is that philosophy is about, at a basic level, deep reflection on a certain topic. It could be about medicine, it could be about ethics, it could be about morality, it could be about metaphysics, and so on and so forth, you know. So we've heard that before, and like I mentioned, even if you are to indicate like individual philosophers, I like giving the example of the Ethiopian philosopher Zara Yacob. In the 17th century. This is an accomplished philosopher by his own right who talks about gender equality centuries before American waves of feminism come into play.
Yeah.
These are seldom noted, but they are there. If you are talking about philosophy as an individual pursuit in which someone deeply reflects about a concept, but what was dominant was the collective nature of deep reflection. And you can find this in a variety of platforms. When it's speaking about Ubuntu, that's a deep thing. It's not popular wisdom. When you look at it critically, it's a deep concept because you're thinking of what it means to be in the world. You're questioning your role as a person in the universe. What should you do?
So the name dropping, Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, Voltaire, etc., that we see with, let's say, European Enlightenment age, could someone almost say it also reflects their society, which we always argue is very individualistic, while, let's say, in Africa, it's much more collective. So that we had a philosophy existing in Africa, but it was not so individualized that you have to throw names and drop names left, right, and center, but reflecting, let's say, the European philosophy, Western philosophy. Because the system is also so individualistic, everybody wants to do a thing for their own self, then you have all these names propping up.
Yeah, and the question behind individualism is the question of proprietary,
Proprietary.
Because you want to own, you want to own ideas. And you want to own it as a person.
And patent it.
And copyright it.
Yeah.
And you have all these massive laws fashioned out of centuries of...
The advent of capitalism, actually.
Yeah.
Because I remember in one course where we were discussing the rise of the West in global comparison. So the great divergence debate. Why did the West, let's say in 1500, when, let's say, China was far much more ahead than Western Europe in the 1500s, but like 2-3 centuries later, the West has opened a huge gap, even though people can say today China's virtually closed the gap. And not only China, but also East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. So one of the arguments being put for the Great Divergence and why, let's say, capitalism developed in Western Europe was because of the concept of private property, John Locke, and also this idea that if you invent something, you can patent it, and then you make millions out of it, and then it brought in the incentive and motivation to become an inventor. So anyway, it still ties in nicely to the individualistic aspect that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think what the West has done is to insinuate itself as superior to others, which is never the case. And even in terms of philosophy, they've sort of tried to insinuate that the Western idea of philosophy is the standard form of philosophy. And if you engage in any other thing, then that is ethnophilosophy. It's a philosophy that is hyphenated. It's no longer philosophy.
And that it even developed uniquely from, let's say, ancient Greece, whereas so many, let's say, Afrocentric scholars have made the strong case that even ancient Greece, they learnt a lot from the Levant, Mesopotamia, and also Northern Africa, especially ancient Egypt. And if you look at the geographical proximity, it also makes sense. The idea that there was an indigenous rise of ancient Greek philosophy, as well as civilization, and it was entirely unique and divorced from the surrounding regions. Like, it's an idea which pretty much is a very standard one and has been made since, let's say, 1500, but a lot of people say it's a myth. Or it's not a very strong and valid argument to say, hey, we developed this thing internally of our own volition and we had zero outside influence.
I think if one thing that I've learned from history, which I hold so dear, is the idea that no civilization is permanent. Civilizations come and go. Modernities come and go. So now we find ourselves entrapped by the Western modernity. But it doesn't mean it's the only one. It will come and go. And you mentioned China and said that at some point China sort of lost.
Yeah, because in debates about the Great Divergence, Jared Diamond, you can talk about so many other scholars, Joel Moki, etc. Like, a lot of scholars agree that in, let's say, 1500s, start of the 16th century, China was far much more ahead in so many technologies, so many inventions.
I mean, look at the naval fleets. China had the best in the 15th century.
Exactly. But shortly after, you had the rise of capitalism and imperialism and the slave trade, which also started, and also the rise of modern capitalism. And all these factors came into a confluence to make the West propel much further than China. And some people argue, it's simple, the Chinese were not imperialists. I mean, Yanis Varoufakis has made the argument a couple of times. Like, they were not imperialists. They were not colonizers. They didn't go outside and extract resources and labor from all over across the world.
You know, but we need to be careful with China.
Yeah.
Because at the beginning of the 15th century, the Chinese fleet docked at the east coast of Africa, actually in Malindi, Pate Island. That's, I think, 1417, the year 1417, way before the first European ever stepped into the east coast of Africa, which I think happened later on towards the century.